Good evening, class. My name is Kristen Williams, and I did my novel presentation over My Bondage and My Freedom by Frederick Douglass. Here's my presentation. Frederick Douglass was born in the year 1817 in Talbot, Maryland. And Talbot is right here, if you can see that. Frederick Douglass remained a slave until his early 20s when he decided to run away to New Bedford, New York. He married a woman named Anna and lived out the rest of his life as a traveling abolitionist, editor, and author until 1895. Here's a picture of his wife, and here's a picture of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass started off living on a plantation with his grandmother and grandfather. As he grows up, his grandmother takes him to a new slave master, Colonial Lloyd, aka Captain Anthony. He was starved by the slave cook Aunt Caddy for days throughout the week. He started to witness floggings and whippings of the other slaves on the plantation and realized how bad slavery was in his own eyes. He gets transferred to a new plantation in Baltimore with the Auld family, where his love for reading and writing began. Sophia Auld, the master's wife, treated him with respect and kindness until her husband demanded her to stop. He was then taken to Edward Covey, his worst slave master. He was known to break down slaves mentally and physically. Covey broke down Douglass's spirit and motivation until one day, Frederick Douglass fought back. Douglass was then a slave to William Freeland. He was one of his best slave masters. He continued his education and taught other slaves there to read and to write. With his knowledge, he began to come up with a plan to escape the plantation, and he got his friends along with him to try and escape. But sadly, Mr. Freeland figured out about their plan and they were sent to jail. Frederick Douglass was taken out of jail by Thomas Auld, and he started to work with him and trying to figure out how to caulk ships. Once he left that, he went to New York, married his wife Anna, and became a famous abolitionist, writer, editor, and so forth. Obviously, the main character of the novel is Frederick Douglass. He is the protagonist, the narrator. He was born into slavery and endured a long journey of pain through multiple slave masters. His main defense was his knowledge and faith in God. He is a dynamic character because he changed a lot throughout his novel. He started off being very down about slavery because of Mr. Covey, but because of his knowledge and his faith in God, he allowed that to bring him out of his bad spirits and started to write about his own experiences and started to become a better person. The other major character is Sophia Auld. She is the one who taught him how to read, or taught him how to read the alphabet. She was very kind to him, and like I said before, she was very kind to him until her husband told her not to be. She is also a dynamic character because at first she was very kind and very loving to Frederick Douglass, and then she had a change in heart when her husband told her about herself and became very mean and very disrespectful to him. The next person is the worst slave master he ever had, Edward Covey. He's the antagonist of the story because of out of all the slave masters he ever had, he was the worst one. He is known as the slave breaker. He brutally beat his slaves for no reason, and he would wait and wait and wait until they did something wrong to brutally beat them. And he wanted their minds to be broken and their bodies to be broken down as well. Frederick Douglass compares him to a snake because, like I said, he had faith in God, and so he compared him to a snake, kind of like how the snake is represented as Satan in the Bible. The era during my bondage and my freedom, especially the historical era, was the era of slavery and the abolitionist movement. It was during the 19th century, and where slavery was very common amongst the South. And as Frederick Douglass, that's why he wanted to escape to New York in the North, because that's where more of the anti-slavery movements and such was going on. And so he wanted to try and break away from the idea that slavery is the norm. He wanted to try and get rid of that. The cultural era, the eras where slaves were known as property, not as people. They were not seen as human. Slaves were below animals at this point. The slave owners treated them with no respect and did not see them as their equals. This novel was during the era of pure discrimination in the education and legal system. As far as the economic era, this novel was written during the era where the economy was shaped around slavery. The more slaves you had, the more land you could harvest, and the more money you could make off of that, the more profit you had. And so slaves also could work outside of the plantation, like Frederick Douglass did when he worked as chalking ships. And the money that he made went back to his slave owners. And so not only were the slave owners getting money by using the slaves and making profits off of them, they also took the slaves' hard earnings that they earned. A main theme in My Bondage and My Freedom is ignorance is not always bliss. The owners kept their slaves ignorant and feared that all the slaves would unite, hold an uprising, and ultimately run away. The other theme that Frederick Douglass really hits on is knowledge is power. And he allows the reader to come up with that conclusion because of how many times he says how reading and writing is so important and how it was so important to him. That he used all the money that he got as a child to buy books, to learn how to read them and learn about what was going on during those times. Frederick Douglass continued to educate himself, although the slave masters' power over their lives. Frederick Douglass continued to educate himself because although the slave master had power over their lives, they did not have power over their minds. One of the main symbols I thought was in the autobiography, because it's not an actual fiction book, but I think a symbol was Sophia Old, because she represented what slavery did to society. At first, people were nice and respectful and kind until slavery was introduced and they had to learn how to become what the typical slave master was. They became more disrespectful and harsh and mean and cruel to the slaves. And she represented that because she had that change of heart whenever her husband told her that he's a slave, you don't treat him nicely, you don't treat him with respect. Why are you teaching him? He is not of us, he's not one of us. Start treating him with less respect. My evaluation of My Bondage and My Freedom, I believe that this autobiography was a good piece of literature. It allows the reader to put themselves in Frederick Douglass's life. They are capable of feeling his emotion and being able to read about how he was brutally beaten and how he had to live in the woods while he was running away from the slave catchers without any food, water, or anything to drink. And he really puts in his emotions into the book, and you can really dive into his life, and that's what I thought was really cool. One of the quotes from the book that kind of kept with me through when I was reading it is, "I am a slave for life, a slave with no rational ground to hope for freedom." And what that quote meant to me was that although whenever he did become a free man, he was still a slave to the system. Whenever he went to New York, and whenever he was traveling out of the country, when he went to England, people still treated him differently because of the color of his skin. And I feel like that's a problem that is still prominent today. And I think that although African Americans are not slaves anymore, I think there are things in our society that people still hold against us. His words are very powerful and can enlighten the reader on the struggles of being a slave in America during that time. The question we're supposed to answer is my bondage and my freedom literary? I believe that yes, it is literary. The novel is worth reading because it is like a time capsule to the past. The novel informs the reader on the struggles and the endearment that Frederick Douglass endured during his time as a slave and also as a freedman. It gives you a different aspect of the world from a slave's viewpoint instead of the usual white slave owner viewpoint that we look through in our history books. This was being able to dive into his life and see what it really was like as a slave and the trials and tribulations that they had to face. Thank you very much for listening to me talk about My Bondage and My Freedom. You can pick up an inexpensive copy from Half Price Bookstore. It is a really great read, and thanks for watching. If you have any questions, just ask me on my discussion board on our eCampus thing. So yeah.